to this, and I can safely say that I've had a really great last year and 3 months here in the state. Very pleased to be here. So today I'm going to talk about sustainable disease management in the home vegetable garden. In general, I take an IPM approach whenever I'm teaching topics like this, and it doesn't really matter if it's a conventional grower or an organic grower, if it's a large-scale producer versus a smaller gardener. I take an IPM approach. So IPM stands for Integrated Pest Management, and my focus is disease as a plant pathologist. And so if nothing else, I hope that you pay attention to some of the pictures that I've included in my presentation, because a picture can tell 1,000 words. It can trigger something in your mind if you see something in the garden or in your planting. It can trigger something in your mind, I think I've seen that before, I think it's a disease, and then that can help you get in touch with your county extension agent for more help. And so on this slide we've got, this is gummy stem blight of melon there. You can see those are actually reddish exudates there on that melon stem. This is a really common one of pepper, that's bacterial spot, and that's on jalapeno fruit. And so the bacterial spot there causes raised bumps. That's the most common disease of pepper in Kentucky. And then this is sort of a zoomed out view of what cucurbit downy mildew can do to cucumbers. Can just pretty much wipe them out in the span of a couple of weeks. So today I'll give an overview of IPM, and then I'll talk about specific crop groups to give you a little bit more specific examples. So IPM stands for Integrated Pest Management, and the way I think about this is as a pyramid of tactics. And so in general, when you use IPM, you focus a lot of your time and attention on these lower levels, and the least time and attention is spent at the upper part. And so in terms of conventional versus organic versus sustainable, somewhere in the middle, the chemical portion is the only part that's different, at least in terms of disease management. There are differences for other types, for other cultural practices that you may use, such as fertilizers, that sort of thing. But in terms of disease management, the only thing that's different are the chemicals. Between conventional and organic approaches. And so the reason we put so much of our focus on these lower levels, while they can sometimes be time consuming, they're the least toxic things that we can do to produce crops. And by really laying the groundwork at these low levels, it may reduce or completely eliminate your need for chemicals. So that's why I focus kind of on the bottom parts. That's where most of our time and attention is spent. And so this is just an overview before we launch into the specific crops about each part of that pyramid. And so this reaches across all different plants that you're growing. One preventative disease management tactic is developing cropping sequences. And so you don't want to be growing the same plants in the same area of the garden for year after year after year. By sequencing your crops, by moving them around, you can reduce the potential of developing disease in certain plants. Some of our pathogens, which are the biological agents that cause disease, some of our pathogens are soil-borne. And they stay in the soil year after year, and they'll stay in that same spot. And so by planting the same plants in that same spot year after year, you're basically feeding those pathogens, you're feeding those fungi or bacteria or water molds just what they like to eat. And you allow them to persist and sometimes even build up. By rotating between crop families, you can kind of keep those pathogens guessing, and you'll keep their levels much lower. And so when I say rotate away from a plant family for 2 or 3 years, I guess I'd ask a question. So let's say you got tomato in this spot this year. Next year you come back with pepper. Is that a rotation? No, it's not, because they're both solanaceous crops. They're both solanaceous crops. And actually, tomato and pepper share some of the same diseases. They can be infected by the same pathogens in some cases. And so when we say rotate between crop families, maybe you go in with tomato one year, you follow with bean, and then follow that with corn. And only in that fourth year should you come back with a solanaceous crop like tomato or pepper. And so to develop cropping sequences, I really encourage keeping a garden journal as well. Another preventative disease management tactic is to choose your varieties carefully. And so when you're choosing varieties, and this information is available from seed catalogs, it's available on seed ordering websites. You can see this is just a screen capture from Seedway, just one example. And so sometimes there's a code in terms of the disease reaction, but for best results, especially on a small scale or in the home garden, we really encourage choosing disease-resistant varieties because it eliminates or slows down your need for using chemicals to produce the plants. And so this is just an example. It's Pink Girl. Along with the maturity and the size, shape of the fruit and the type of plant, it gives this disease reaction. And so you want to choose varieties that have resistance to diseases that you normally experience in the garden. And so some really common ones for us here in Kentucky on tomato are things like early blight or septoria. If you're a pepper grower, bacterial spot of pepper, you would want to be looking for resistance to bacterial spot in that one. If it's bean, anthracnose. Anthracnose is one of the most common diseases that we get in bean. So moving up that pyramid, and this is another general statement about sanitation. In general, sanitation is really important, and that's just generally being clean. That's being clean. So that's using pathogen-free seed or seed that you've cleaned yourself. You can heat treat seed. It can be done on the stovetop with a little bit of effort. I like to do it more in a the apparatus is called like a sous vide, but it's kind of like a crock pot. And so, and that information can be found in ID 36 if you're interested. It's in one of the appendices. In addition to using clean seed, you want to use clean pots or clean flats. To clean those containers from year to year, you want to look at using a 10% bleach solution. So that's 1 part bleach, 9 parts water. If you just dip those previously, basically remove all the soil and all the potting media from those containers, dip them, let them dry, and then I'd hose them off to prevent the buildup of salt on there. Sometimes you get a salty residue. That'll eliminate over 99% of pathogens from reused containers. And then another cleanliness factor is to remove debris during the season. So let's say you've got dying plant parts or you've got some leaves that have fallen off. I would just walk the garden with a bag and pick those dead leaves up, put them in the bag and just throw them in the trash. In general, pathogens can persist, so fungi can persist on dead plant material, and that can really ramp up your disease situation in the garden. By removing that, you can remove fungal spores, you can remove pathogen pressure from your garden. If that material is infected, I wouldn't recommend putting it in a home compost pile, because typically home compost piles don't really get hot enough to eliminate pathogens from that tissue. It's the heating of those piles that will eliminate pathogens. And so we're moving up the pyramid. I'll talk just generally about physical and mechanical controls. In general, physical and mechanical controls are creating an unfavorable environment for disease to develop. And so these are things like maximizing air movement around plants. When a plant leaf is wet, the fungal spores that are in the environment, which are kind of like fungal seeds, they require moisture in order to germinate and infect leaves. And so the drier you can keep leaves, the better off you are in terms of disease, not just in terms of fungi, but also in terms of bacteria. And so use recommended spacing to encourage airflow around your plants. You also want to manage weeds and volunteers for the same reason, to increase airflow, keep those leaves as dry as possible. Optimize and balance fertility, ensure adequate soil drainage. If your plant roots are sitting in water, that's a stressful condition, and some of our plant pathogens can actually move through water and further infect plants in that way. Pythium is a really common root rot pathogen that takes advantage of the stressful situations plants can sometimes be in if their roots are waterlogged. Floating row cover can be used for, I think of them as vectors, but for insect management, and I think Rick might talk a little bit more about that. And then I'm big into mulch in the home garden. In general, if you can reduce soil contact with any part of the plant, if you can reduce soil contact with the foliar parts of the plant, that'll reduce your overall disease, because many of our plant pathogens overwinter in soils, and that's how they cause their initial infections in plants, by being splashed up onto the plant tissue. And so here's a couple examples. Botrytis gray mold is a really common fungal pathogen. It's common on tomatoes under high humidity conditions, but it's common on a lot of other plants too. It causes gray mold. This is a picture of the floating row covers, just different options. And then I like this picture because you can see how intense the weed pressure is. Right beside this cabbage leaf that has Alternaria leaf spot, which is a fungal pathogen. And so biological control, my picture's not showing up. Is that on the handout?
Yeah.
You can see it, okay, that's good. And so biological control is the next part of our IPM pyramid as we move up. And so this is basically using natural biological competitors to antagonize pests or pathogens. And so these could be things like microbial inoculants. They're frequently soil applied, or sometimes they're a foliar spray. These can be bacteria, fungi, or actinomycetes that are naturally occurring in the environment. And so these are microbes that aren't pathogenic to plants, but they fight against the microbes that are pathogenic to plants. And the simplest way to think about it could be to think about it as the good microbes fighting against the bad microbes. And so the very top of our IPM pyramid is the chemical part. And so in terms of chemical management in the garden, really home gardeners have access to some of the same chemicals that commercial producers have access to. And some of these really form the backbone of commercial producers' chemical management programs. So these are things like copper and chlorothalonil. Those are two very general purpose fungicides, also mancozeb. Those can be found as active ingredients in fungicides from big box stores. I mentioned that, but what you all need to be aware of and what you need to be sure of to maintain, to use those chemicals safely is that you need to be sure that that chemical is labeled for the crop that you intend to spray it on, that you spray it under the conditions outlined in the directions, and that includes personal protective equipment also. That includes your own clothing as well as the conditions that they describe it to be used under. And then you also want to pay attention to pre-harvest intervals. So how soon after spraying is that produce ready to eat? And so some of these are the same tools that commercial growers use. A few different ones are some of these oils. Fewer growers use oils, not because they're not effective, but because they have additional options, additional chemical options. But really the chemical portion of this should take up the least amount of time. It isn't necessarily the cheapest part of what you do, but it should take the least amount of your time. And really, if you're building that pyramid from the bottom up, the chemical portion may or may not even be necessary in some cases. And so that's the IPM pyramid. And now we're going to get into specific crop diseases. So we'll start with the Solanaceae. There's that IPM pyramid, and we're going to talk about this in the context of primarily tomatoes, but also peppers and some other solanaceous crops. So early in the season for tomatoes, you want to be focusing on preventative tactics, and so these are things like using fungicide or heat-treated seed, starting those transplants from treated seed, from seed that's been treated in some way. If you want to heat treat seed, basically you need to I would refer you to ID 36. When I mentioned pasteurizing your transplant media, all that is heating it to 145 for 30 minutes. And I've seen this done in home ovens. You'd want to use an older container for doing this because it's potting media. Wet the media first, and then you want to get it uniformly up to about 145 for 30 minutes. And that'll eliminate a number of pathogens from your transplant media. You want to plant resistant varieties in a different area of the garden than where you had tomatoes or peppers last year. Transplant at wider spacings. Commercial spacing is anywhere from 18 to 24 inches. Since we don't have necessarily as many chemical options as commercial producers do, a slightly wider spacing can help encourage airflow to keep those leaves dry, which will reduce disease. Plant those solanaceous plants pretty deeply, and then mulch to maintain soil moisture, not only soil moisture, but to reduce soil splashing up onto the foliage, and also to reduce weeds. I was actually working in my tomato field earlier today, and I picked out a couple good examples of disease. And so if you all would like to pass this one around. That's early blight. That's a pretty common fungal disease of tomato. If you wouldn't care to pass that around. So early blight causes concentric rings. That disease starts in the very lowest parts of the plant, and then it works its way up the plant tissue. Let's see if there's another one. And so, early blight with those concentric rings is it's pretty striking in terms of its symptomatology. That one there. So it's a dark brown lesion. It's got concentric rings, very common in Kentucky. And I would bet just about anyone who's got tomatoes in the ground right now, you're probably having just a touch of early blight. And so one thing about plant diseases is they don't happen in a vacuum. So in a lot of my pictures, I'll show a particular disease, and there's just one disease there. More often than not, early blight is also happening with septoria. So septoria is another fungal pathogen that causes small lesions on leaves. Those have tan centers. Early blight will infect fruit, where septoria will only infect the foliage and sometimes the stems as well. And so by transplanting at wider spacings and reducing some of that soil splash up onto your plants, you can reduce some of your pressure from septoria and early blight. Getting into mid-season, sanitation and cultural tactics are also important. And so the stakes that you've used, ideally those will have been cleaned with 10% bleach. 10% bleach will eliminate a number of pathogens. Wooden stakes don't tend to get quite as clean as metal stakes do, just because there's more surface area to metal stakes. And really, if you've had pressure from bacterial diseases in the past, I wouldn't recommend reusing your stakes from that year to the next year. You can carry those bacterial pathogens with you to the next year. I mentioned septoria and early blight earlier. Depending on the scale of your garden, you can pinch leaves that are infected with those pathogens. When you pinch those leaves, you just want to put them into a bag and carry them out. You don't want to just drop them on the ground, because that's not eliminating the pathogen from the environment. Just dropping them on the ground, those spores will still be there, just to be splashed right back up into the plant. You don't want to remove a vast proportion of the leaves from your plants. But those very lowest leaves that are affected, maybe one or two leaves on an indeterminate tomato, those can be pinched off. If you see disease in the upper parts of the plant, don't pinch that. Don't pinch that, because it's more likely that could be bacterial or viral in nature. And by pinching the upper parts of the plant, you'll cause more harm to its growth. And there's also potential for you to move the pathogens between plants in that way. But if it's in the lower growth, it's more likely that you'll be okay to pinch that. And then ensure adequate plant nutrition as well. Here's some pictures of bacterial diseases of tomato. In general, bacterial diseases can be managed with copper and appropriate plant spacing. And these are diseases this is a case where you wouldn't want to be pinching the plants. And so bacterial diseases, you'll see them especially flare up in the youngest tissue. That's where bacterial diseases really take off, is in the young tissue. So this is bacterial speck. Bacterial speck can dominate when we've got cool, wet summers. Bacterial spot, which is shown down here and over here, that'll dominate a little bit more when it's hot and wet. And then bacterial canker, that's one that can seed, but especially bacterial canker can. Canker is less common than speck and spot, and the primary way it's introduced is via seed or contaminated stakes. And so that's another reason why, if you've had a heavy disease year, one year, you don't want to carry those stakes over to the next year without cleaning them. So in mid-season, you want to stay on top of your weeding. And so this isn't just for plant competition. This is to maximize airflow. This is to eliminate potential sources of pathogens in our tomatoes. And so I have another example of a plant from the field. And anyone who touches this plant, please wash your hands afterward. Not because any chemicals have been sprayed, but because it's got a viral disease. I'm pretty confident that it's got tomato spotted wilt virus in it. This was the only plant that we found in my field that had tomato spotted wilt. And so this disease manifests differently from our fungal diseases. You can see ring spots on the leaves. There's some ring spots forming up on the fruit too. The symptoms are developing in the very youngest parts of the plant tissue, which is different from our fungal diseases, from our fungal pathogens. There's some ring spots on the fruit there too, and on these leaves as well. And so if you regularly grow tomatoes, you might mistake this for something like early blight. But the difference is this disease has started in the younger tissue, and that's because viral diseases move from source to sink. So they move along with the photosynthase, they move along with the sugars that are produced in the plants. And that's where we see quite a bit of pressure from viral diseases. And then that's spotty too.
Did you dig it up to be natural?
I dug it up to protect the other plants. Yeah, so by leaving this in the planting, this disease is vectored by thrips, which are insects, which Rick might be able to tell us more about a little bit later. But since thrips can move the virus through the planting, basically to protect the other plants, I removed this one. You can see the ring spots. And the lower tissue is primarily clean.
So the wilting part of that problem, or is that just depending on the water?
So I pulled it a couple hours ago. There's a little bit of wilting symptoms, but for the most part, it's spottiness. And I'll keep this plant out too. That's a good example. And then the fruit's spotty too. So in general, viral diseases tend to be some of our least common diseases in the garden, but when you do get them, they can be particularly problematic because we don't have sprays for them. We don't have anything to spray that would work for them. Basically, it's removing the plant in order to protect all the plants around it. So in terms of your other mid-season controls, the reason I got off topic on the tomato spotted wilt is because that plant, it's likely that plant was infected by an insect moving from an infected plant and then feeding on that plant. So tomato spotted wilt, even though it's named tomato spotted wilt, it can persist in weeds. And so, the probability of there being an infested weed somewhere around the field is pretty high. We know that it isn't readily seed transmitted. That's not how That's not how that virus moves around. And so what that suggests to me is that there's an infected weed somewhere around that field. And so that's another reason why managing weeds in your garden is really important. And so some other general things to remember about in the mid-season for solanaceous disease management are mulching, again, staking plants firmly. You don't want to injure the plants, but you also want them to stay put. And then water plants at the soil line. Best practice is in the morning. And so if any of that water does splash up onto the foliage, it can dry relatively quickly.
Why not in the evening?
So in the evening, the foliage will stay wet longer. It'll stay wet all night through. And so if there are fungal spores or bacteria that have gotten splashed up on there, they have all night to infect the plant. And so in the work that I do, when we want to get disease, we spray the plants with the pathogens, and then we keep them wet all night. And it basically gives the pathogens the best chance to infect the tissue. And so in mid and late season, the focus is on sanitation and chemicals. And so copper is good for bacterial and fungal diseases. Chlorothalonil and mancozeb, those are more used for fungal and oomycete diseases, fungal and water mold diseases. Those are all foliar approaches also. And so if you have a soil-borne disease, spraying these plants with those chemicals, with what most homeowners have access to, isn't gonna help that problem. If it's a soil-borne disease, your best approaches are to increase soil drainage, basically reduce standing water where your plants are, or to remove, as I did with the tomato, remove the plant basically so that it's not a source of pathogens to infect all the other plants around it. Some of our organic options are copper, sulfur, and some of the horticultural oils, if you're interested in that. You want to be sure that you're harvesting fruit carefully, because anytime we injure a plant, that's an opening for a pathogen to get into it. And at the end of the season, don't compost your diseased plants. You just want to dispose of them in the trash, or you can burn them. In general, many of our pathogens won't compost. They won't be eliminated by composting, because home compost piles don't really get hot enough. Commercial ones do, but home ones don't. And I'm big into record keeping. So by keeping records, you can keep track of what disease was a problem this year versus the year before. You can identify trends, and by identifying trends, you can be better prepared when it shows up next year. So I'm going to shift gears to cucurbits. Are there any questions about solanaceous plants right now? There's our IPM pyramid. Again, the focus is in these lower levels, and we kind of work our way up to the chemicals. Early in the season, you want to sow treated seed into warmed soils. Cucurbits are sensitive to cold soils. They don't do real well if you set them out too early. You want to plant varieties with resistance to common diseases. And so when I said that cucurbits don't do real well when we set them out too early, that also makes them more susceptible to infection by some of our most common pathogens like Pythium. Those cold soils allow water molds like Pythium to really proliferate. And not only that, but it stresses out the plants to where they're more susceptible, they're easier to become infected. It's like their natural defenses are down. You want to plant varieties with resistance to common diseases. We get downy mildew in cucurbits every year. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And so we don't have varieties that have true resistance, but we do have varieties with tolerance. And what tolerance does is it buys you some time. or the disease just doesn't get quite as bad in those crops, and you can sometimes yield off of them even in the worst of years. Powdery mildew is also common. That's another disease that you should look for resistance to in cucurbit crops. And in general, you want to be training vines down the row, and that's to reduce injury, because anytime a plant's injured, there's possibility for pathogens to get into those injured plant parts. So this is a picture, and I hope it's a little bit better on your handout, but this is a picture of a squash leaf that's infected with both powdery mildew and downy mildew, two really common diseases. Powdery mildew is more common on the tops of leaves, and it gets its name from its powdery appearance. It grows on top of the leaf, and it looks powdery. It's gray to white. The sporulation is the most apparent part. Powdery mildew grows right over leaf veins. And that's differentiated from downy mildew. Downy mildew, it becomes very apparent on the underside of leaves. And it has dark sporulation. It's purple to black, almost. That's delimited by the leaf veins, so it's bordered by the leaf veins. You can't grow over the leaf veins. And so that's how you differentiate the two of those. It's important to be able to differentiate those because the chemicals that are effective on powdery mildew are not as effective on downy mildew, and vice versa. In drier years, we see more pressure from powdery mildew. In wet years, we see more pressure from downy mildew. So in the early and mid-season, you want to be managing your weeds. Again, that increases airflow around your crops. Reduce pathogen, and it also reduces pathogen reservoirs, in addition to competition for nutrients. You want to prevent fruit from contacting soil. So whenever fruit have direct contact with soil, there are soil fungi that can rot those fruit. Both fungi and water molds can basically attack those fruit. And so if possible, it's great to have them on a mulch layer or on if you have plastic beds in the garden, put them on the plastic. Floating row covers can help protect your plants from the carriers of bacterial wilt. Rick might be able to tell us more about that. And then you want to avoid wetting leaves by watering plants at the soil line. Just try not to get the foliage too wet. In mid to late season, we shift our focus a little bit more toward the physical, biological, and chemical tactics. So you want to avoid working plants when they're wet. When plants are wet, they're easier to injure. You want to mulch. That helps promote beneficial microbes in the soil, but it also helps keep the foliage drier. And then applying fungicides. Copper isn't effective on some of our bacterial diseases, but it is effective on others. And so it really depends on what kind of bacterial disease that you have in the garden to know if copper is going to be effective for that. And another important point, sulfur shouldn't be used on cucurbits at all. It can burn up cucurbits. So I'm shifting toward the legumes, the beans now. Fungicide-treated seed, peas can be sown pretty early and they do all right. Beans, you should wait on beans. A number of folks want to save bean seed, and I understand why. For the benefit of growing an heirloom variety. One word of caution, if you are saving bean seed, make sure you're saving it from only the best pods. Pods that look to be infected or diseased in any way, that's your starting material for next year. And so seed that's saved from those beans can be, basically you can be saving infected seed. And the plants that you grow out from that seed will also be infected. You want to plant varieties with resistance to common diseases, anthracnose and rust. There's good resistance in beans to those two diseases. Root rots can be common, but by promoting drainage, good drainage, and by using treated seed, you can avoid a lot of those root rots. And then spacing plants, again, to maintain that airflow, keep those leaves dry. When you're trellising beans, you want to do that when the plants are on the young side, and make sure that they're dry, again, because you can move bacterial pathogens from plant to plant if those plants are wet. You want to manage weeds early and avoid wetting the leaves. Again, just water at the soil line. Here's some common diseases of bean. This is angular leaf spot. That's caused by a fungal pathogen. And then this is bacterial blight on pea. It's one of the few things that we see on pea in Kentucky. And then mid to late season, you want to harvest often and really carefully, again, just to reduce plant injury. And then when you're thinking about applying chemicals, you want to apply the right chemical for the right disease. And so it's labeled for that crop. You're using it safely in terms of wearing the right protective equipment, and you're spraying it at the recommended time. And then you're only going back into the garden after the prescribed amount of time has passed. And so in general, these are the chemicals that most homeowners can, with reasonable effort, find, and the types of diseases that they're recommended for. And so the options that have organic, that have certified organic options associated with them have the asterisk. So there's copper, sulfur, and horticultural oils that have organic options. Copper is really our main chemical for bacterial disease reduction. It can also manage fungal leaf spots. Chlorothalonil and mancozeb, you want to check the label to be sure it's safe to be used on those crops. Those are also general fungal leaf spot chemical management. And then sulfur and horticultural oils, those tend to be better on the rusts and powdery mildews. And then finally, phosphorus acid is kind of difficult to find, but under low disease pressure situations, that can be effective for some of our waterborne pathogens. And so I've gone over different general types of diseases, but when you're experiencing these diseases in the garden, the best approach is to call your county extension agent for advice on what you're actually looking at. Because it can be a waste of time and money if you're spraying the wrong chemical for a particular disease. And so really you want a confident diagnosis. If you're not confident in what you're looking at, there are people here to help. And so I'm shifting into leafy greens and then we'll finish up. So again, certified pathogen-free seed or treated seed, and that should be sown into some high organic matter soil. Resistance to the common diseases of some of our leafy greens are downy mildew, and there's resistance to some bacterial diseases as well. And so when you're picking out varieties, that's what you want to be looking for. Spaced your plants appropriately. This is what happens when plants are not spaced appropriately. You can get some gray mold pressure in your leafy greens. And you also want to be mulching plants to reduce some of that foliar contact with soil. In the mid to late season, basically if you see a leafy green plant going down, and it's just one or two plants, the best approach is to remove that plant in an effort to save all the ones around it. By removing that plant, by carrying it out of the garden, you're removing the pathogen from the environment. You want to manage weeds, avoid wetting the leaves, and then protect plants. One of the only things that's labeled for leafy greens in the home garden is copper. And so if you are choosing to spray, that's one of your only options in the home garden. And so this is the summary. In general, garden disease management is proactive and preventative. And so we've talked about resistant varieties, using clean seed or transplants that basically look good. If you start with a plant that's diseased, it's unlikely to become better as the season progresses. You want to create an unfavorable environment for disease. So keep those leaves dry, reduce contact with soil, mulch to minimize moisture fluctuations, to reduce that leaf contact with soil. Keep the plants dry. If the plants are wet, don't train them, don't trellis them, in that condition, just wait till they're dry. You want to scout your plots regularly for disease. You can't know what's out there unless you're looking for it. Apply the right chemical for the right disease. At the end of this season, you want to remove the plant debris because lots of pathogens can persist with plant debris. And then I like garden journals to help you develop sequences, help you stay on top of, okay, I got disease at this point in time last year. I might want to expect it this year at about the same time, that sort of thing. And then there's resources out there to help you. So the ICAM scouting guides are all online, and they have excellent pictures in there. There's also the Sustainable Home Gardening Fact Sheets that's available on the Plant Path Publications page online. And then there's a really beautiful home vegetable gardening guide that we just updated for this year. And that's available through your county extension office as well. So at this point, are there any questions about disease management in home gardens? Has anyone ever seen tomato spotted wilt virus before? Just Greg. It is a little bit more of a rare disease, but it was a nice example to show, the potential impact of weeds as reservoirs for disease.
All right, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? So it's a little challenging when I don't have my glasses on to see the small switches. Well, my name is Rick Besson. I'm the extension entomologist, and I work with fruits and vegetables. I'm going to talk to you about insect control, insect management in home gardens. And I think a lot of the things I'm going to say are going to be very compatible. In fact, some of the things I'm going to say are identical to what Dr. Pfeiffer has mentioned, particularly things with sanitation, preventive controls, weed management. You're going to see that theme coming up over and over again with this. So what we're trying to do with managing insects is we're trying to suppress and prevent these pests without having a big impact on human health, the environment, or non-target organisms. I mean, we don't want to spray insecticide on our produce and then pick it and eat it when it has a lot of insecticide residue still left on there. So we have to be very careful with that. In terms of non-target organisms, we've been hearing a lot about the effect on honeybees and having to watch out for pollinators and honeybees. So, one of the things that I feel very strongly about, that's why I put it very early, is that if you cannot identify your problem, you don't identify it correctly, you're probably not going to manage it effectively. I mean, if you don't know what you're fighting, you're just throwing stuff at it. It's probably not going to work. So the first step always with a problem is getting it properly identified. Very, very important. It's always the first step. So, and you want to get these things identified early. You don't want to identify a problem when your plants are almost overrun by that problem. You want to catch it in its infancy, when it's just starting off. Keep in mind, in the home garden, many of the problems that you see are not due to biological organisms. They may be due to environmental stress, weather, soil, temperature, things like that, even drought. If you get the same pest or disease problem year after year, you're going to gain experience and you're going to get better at recognizing that pest if it's reoccurring. So if you get a new problem on some of your vegetables, or maybe you're trying a new vegetable that you haven't grown before and you see some problems with it, how are you going to get it identified when you have a problem? What's your best resource? Your extension office. Give Ty a call. Have Ty come out, take a look at the plants. The one really nice thing about insects are big. I'm sorry, Emily. Your pathogens are small. But big insects mean that if you have a cell phone, you can take a picture of an insect and you can, send an email to Ty, and he can possibly identify it right from the picture. If he doesn't know, the same morning he can send that email to me in Lexington, and I can look at it, and you might get your answer back before lunch. So it's really quick with taking some pictures like that. It's a lot better than the old days when we had to mail everything. Regular monitoring, same thing that Dr. Pfeiffer was talking about. Got to stress regular monitoring. At a bare minimum, that's once a week. Bare minimum. Twice a week I feel pretty good about twice a week. Things aren't going to surprise you too much if you're out there twice a week with insects. With a lot of these insects, with things like aphids and mites, and I'm going to throw mites in with the insects, and other organisms, you have to flip over the leaves to find them. So it's not just walking through the garden and looking at the tops of the plants. You have to bend over, you have to flip those leaves over, see what's on the undersides of those leaves. Look for the signs of chewing and sucking insects. Chewing insects, it's easy because you got holes in the leaves. Sucking insects, what they do is they produce honeydew. You get this honeydew that drips on the leaves. It's sugar water. And so you look for that sticky sugar water on the lower leaves, or maybe you look for some of that black sooty mold that grows on that sugary water. Those are great signs that you have problems with whiteflies or aphids, or even leafhoppers and mealybugs will do that. Take notes. And I know there's probably not a single person in here that wants to garden just so they can take notes. But it is important. I know the older I get, if I didn't write it down, it didn't happen because I won't remember. And so it's good to take notes. What you saw this week, well, I saw some aphids on the lettuce. Next week, you can compare that. You can see if the problems are staying the same, getting worse, or even getting better. Sometimes when we start to get the heat of the summer, there's certain things that go away. There's other things that start to appear in the heat of the summer. Pay attention to those plants that are not doing well. Also, know your tolerance level for your pests. One strategy with insect pests in the home garden is, one zucchini plant's probably going to give me all the zucchini I need for my family. But if I plant 2 or 3 plants, I know that even if one of them goes down, I'm still going to have, plenty of zucchini. So you can overplant, that increases your tolerance level to certain problems. Things that feed on the leaves, like Japanese beetles that are defoliating plants, are not doing as much damage as the ones that are tunneling in the vines. So borers like the squash vine borer, that can bring a whole plant down. Japanese beetle, one beetle is probably only going to make a small golf ball size wound to a leaf. And so it's fairly minor. So keep in mind that how they damage the plants can impact how much damage you can tolerate. So develop a management plan. And you may not think about it, but there's cultural controls, just what Dr. Pfeiffer said. Cultural controls tend to be preventive in nature. So when we've had problems year after year with the same insect pest, I say, hey, I need to think about doing a cultural control in advance to try and prevent that problem in the first place. Physical controls, biological controls, and the last one I have down there is pesticide sprays. And purposefully, pesticides, don't like them, but sometimes we need to use them. That's the last resort. So, cultural methods that I recommend. First, proper plant selection for the site. You get the right type of plant in the right location, it's going to tolerate insect damage better. If you have a plant that's in the wrong situation, it's a plant that doesn't like over wet soil, it's not going to tolerate insect pests very well. So, just with diseases, if they're resistant or tolerant plants, there are some plants that are resistant to insects. I was with an Amish grower down in Allen County. He had a long 300-foot row of cucumbers, and I asked him what he did for cucumber beetles and bacterial wilt. He says, I don't do anything. I said, why? Yeah, and his kids were out there with a wheelbarrow picking pickles. And I said, well, what's your strategy? He goes, well, I use Arkansas little leaf cucumbers. I don't need to control cucumber beetles, and I don't get the bacterial wilt. See, that's just, he learned what was a resistant variety for that particular problem. So, resistant means the pests don't do well on it. Tolerant means even though you got the pest, you're going to still get a similar yield. It's not going to knock you back on the yield that much. Pay attention to your plants. Watering and nutrients are very important. If we over-fertilize plants, that's like a feeding stimulant to certain insects. If you really go heavy on the nitrogen, you're going to increase the reproductive rate of aphids. It's like vitamins for the aphids. So be careful to appropriately water and fertilize your plants. So, sanitation. Remove crop residue after harvest. That, we cut the head off the cabbage plant, you got those wrapper leaves that are still on the ground there. We think, well, they're not going to do anything, I'll clean them up in the fall when I'm done. But there's still insects feeding on those wrapper leaves that you leave in the garden. And they have to get to a certain stage so they can successfully pass the winter. By removing those wrapper leaves, the day that you harvested that head, you're starving them out. They're not going to get to that stage. They need to spend the winter. So the trash we leave behind in the garden is still a smorgasbord for some of these insect pests. So just as soon as you've finished harvest from that plant, the plant needs to be bagged up, taken out of the garden. I know this isn't for vegetables, but on fruit plants, you want to remove the insect galls. When you're pruning plants in the winter, cut out those insect galls. Reduce hiding places for pests. A lot of our insects, hot days like this, they like getting under boards and rocks and tires and buckets and things like that. The more stuff you leave in the garden, It's the more hiding places for these insects. So a clean garden is good. Remove dead limbs, that's fruit stuff. Heavily infested plants. There comes a point, it's not worth trying to save the plant anymore. You know, it's just covered up, it's eaten up. It's time to really pull that plant, bag it up, get it out of there. Some of those very heavily infested things are best removed from the garden. And keep your garden weed free. Exactly what Dr. Piper said. We don't need, the weeds are not doing any good. She was saying that they reduce air movement, they reduce inoculum of the pathogens in the garden. They also remove a lot of the insect pests. A lot of the insect pests are growing and developing on those weeds. Some of them are picking up those pathogens and they're transmitting it to your vegetable plants. That's what we call vectors. So that tomato spotted wilt virus plant she showed you, it probably started with thrips on some weeds. And how the thrips pick up the virus, they can only acquire the virus when they're in the immature stage, when they're not full grown. And then when they become full grown, they can begin to transmit it. So it takes a long time for them to acquire it, go to the next stage before they can begin to transmit it. But once they transmit it, they can transmit it for life. So what you want to do, eliminate those weeds, you're going to reduce the thrips, and you're going to help prevent them from acquiring the virus. So rotating plants, again, very similar to plant disease. It works very well with vegetable gardening because our vegetables are annual plants. Every year you're going to be switching locations, switch plant families. Now some people ask me, well, how far do I have to move? If I had corn here this year, how far do I have to move it in my garden for next year? Well, with some of the soil insects with corn, all you have to do is move it about 3 feet. So if you took that one plot you had for corn last year, and you grow your corn at least 3 feet away from that old plot, that's helping with those soil insect problems. It's a very short distance. And rotation helps with insects, with insects that overwinter in immature stages in the ground. Because they're immature, they can't fly to wherever you've moved that plot. So wireworms and corn rootworm and things like that it helps a lot with those pests. Some other cultural controls. Think about when you plant your crop. It can actually impact your insect control. So if you want to have sweet corn that doesn't have worms in the tips of your ear, try and plant your corn before the middle of June. Right now we're really getting to the end of that insect-free period. We start planting corn, the 15th of June, maybe the 25th of June. That's much more likely to have, every ear with a little worm in the tip of that ear. Now the reason is, some of these insects overwinter in the Gulf. And it takes them a few months to actually get up here in the summer. And so when we plant early, we're actually going to harvest that crop before they had a chance to infest that crop. Really helps with sweet corn. With the vining crops, if we delay planting, actually if we start planting some of our crops now or transplanting melons and things like that, cucumber beetles are on their way down this time of year. The overwintering generation has done a lot of its feeding. It's already laid its eggs. And it's going to be, the end of June, early July when the next generation comes out. So we're going to get into a sort of a lull period with some of these pests. Companion plants can help. So we've done some research at UK. Things like buckwheat provides nectar and pollen, and it actually brings in a lot of the beneficial insects. And we've seen that we can reduce some insect problems by 33 to 50% by using companion plants. Trap cropping, we did a study last year with trap crops for stink bugs. We surrounded a pepper field with sunflowers and millet. And the idea is when the stink bugs start moving around, they come to something they really like. And you can see right here all the sunflower heads and the millet stalks there. And they really like that, so they stop when they get to that, and they don't continue on into the peppers. Last year, we reduced pepper damage by about 50%. It wasn't 100%, but you know, the more we can reduce it, that means the more for us. Cover cropping helps too, because cover cropping provides a good habitat to increase beneficial insects. And if you have the garden space available, you know, when you're not growing something there, put in a cover crop. It helps with soil structure and soil health, and it also helps with some natural enemies. So just some specifics on a few crops here. Sweet corn. Don't plant sweet corn into ground that you just turned over from sod. Sod is full of white grubs and wireworms, and those attack sweet corn kernels. So avoid following sod. I like getting varieties with excellent tip coverage. And so when I read those seed catalogs, I always look for ones that say excellent seed coverage, good tight husk, because that's going to eliminate or reduce problems with sap beetles in the tip of the ear, bird damage to the tip of the ear, and it's going to limit corn earworm damage to the tip of the ear. So tip coverage is very good. Again, plant before June 1st to avoid corn earworm problems. If you're going to plant later, we've done some work with mineral oil and actually using rubber bands on the tips of the ears. Just when those silks come out, you wait about 4 days after pollen shed, and you can put a little bit of mineral oil or a rubber band on the tip of the ear. Now, how do you know you've gone to pollen shed? When the tassel's up, you shake that plant, you're just going to see a shower of pollen come off. That's pollen shed. If you do it too early, the mineral oil or the rubber band actually interferes with pollination, and you end up with a barren ear. So you have to wait 4 days after that pollen shed. For the melons and the squash and cucurbits, that row covers until flowering. So Dr. Pfeiffer showed a nice image of row covers, just the tobacco cloth. Just, you know, it has some wire as hoops over it. Put it on the day you transplant those plants. You know, weight it down around the edge so the insects can't get underneath it. As soon as you start to get to flowering, remove the row covers. We remove them for about 2 weeks to allow those plants to pollinate, and we can put the row covers back on until harvest. So it's very helpful. You can use something like permethrin. You can spray that on the plants when you remove the row cover. The one thing I'm going to really warn you about, though, you're going to spray plants that are flowering. Permethrin will kill bees. I'm a beekeeper myself, so I'm sensitive to it. What I recommend is you spray in the evening. And all the plants in this family have their flowers open for a single day. At night, they close up, and they have new flowers that open up the next day. They only stay open 1 day. Even the melon and the watermelon flowers are only open for a single day. So if you spray late in the evening after the bees aren't there, you're going to contaminate that one flower, but the next day it's going to be closed, and a new flower that's not contaminated is going to be available for the bees. So spray late in the evening. Sometimes with a squash vine borer, it helps to bury some extra nodes on the runners. You get these vines running all over. You throw some shovelfuls of soil on some of those long squash vines, you'll get some additional roots from those nodes. If you put some lady beetles, you can order lady beetles and put them under the row cover if necessary. And the last thing is when you have plants that get wilted, say bacterial wilt, bag them up, get them out of the garden. Cole crops, things like broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, the BT sprays are excellent. This is not a GMO spray. This is just a regular organic spray. It's Bacillus thuringiensis. If a caterpillar eats it, it kills the caterpillars because it puts holes in their stomach, and the microbes that were in their stomach invade the rest of their body, and they die from infection. That's how it kills them. Very specific, very safe, doesn't hurt, beneficial insects. The other thing is, if you get these harlequin bugs, they're these black and orange stink bugs that get on these plants, best thing to do is hand pick. I know it sounds tough, but I help my son with some of his vegetables, and I hand pick some of his pests, and it's actually very effective. With tomatoes and peppers, again, with stink bugs tend to be some of our biggest problems here. Hand picking is very effective on a home basis. If you're tying up your plants, or you're suckering your plants, or you're harvesting your plants, and you get that smell of a stink bug, I'm sure you all know what that smell is. It smells like cilantro. I start looking hard on that plant, and I'll find them. For me, I don't mind squishing. I'll just squish them with my fingers and throw them on the ground. But if you don't like doing that, just tossing them into a bucket of soapy water is going to kill the insects. Netting and row covers can be very effective. And then if you have problems with caterpillars, those same BT sprays are very effective. If you have hornworms feeding on your plants, the BT sprays will kill them. Management of some of these insects, row covers, very good on leafy greens for flea beetles, BT sprays for caterpillars. If you have aphid problems on some of these leafy greens, insecticidal soap. You can get that at most garden centers. Very effective. Another thing you might use is a strong stream of water. Sometimes just a hose and hose down the plants will help with aphids. And again, hand picking of harlequin bug. On potatoes, one thing they found, if you use like 5 or 6 inches of straw mulch when you plant your potatoes, that really seems to reduce the number of Colorado potato beetles. For some reason, it doesn't like that structure of all that mulch. Hand picking of Colorado potato beetles. Actually, that's the pest that I've been helping my son with. When I see them on the plant, I just collect them all. I pick them off before they have a chance to lay eggs. I've seen some people, they'll take a 5-gallon bucket with a little bit of soapy water, and in the morning, they just walk down the row and they just knock all the potato foliage into that bucket of soapy water, and they reduce the Colorado potato beetles that way. Row covers will help. If you want to use an insecticide, Conserve works very well for Colorado potato beetle. If you want to be organic, there's an organic version called Entrust. The problem is it's very expensive. I have a hard time justifying spending a few $100s on a small bottle. But the Conserve actually has the same active ingredient. It's just not organic. So biological control. How important is biological control? When I was in school, I was working at this fruit tree research station, and they had a Mediterranean fruit fly outbreak that occurred. And so the Department of Agriculture came over this entire valley, and they're spraying it with their planes and all that, and they had the right to go into people's yards and pick all their fruit and get rid of that. But the spray they were using was killing all the natural enemies, and I had a chance to see what it was like if we didn't have beneficial insects. And I saw cabbage plants, you couldn't see the leaves through all the aphids on the plant because there was nothing there to eat the aphids. And it taught me how important biological control is, that the natural stuff you're not paying for it, it's just out there 24/7. And it really does slow down the development of pests. And so while you might not be buying natural enemies, you sure don't want to be killing the ones that are out there already. So I just wanted to show you what some of the good bugs are, because it's just as important to recognize the good guys as the pests. And so these are all lady beetles here. So this one we call the 7-spotted lady beetle. That one's the pink one. This is a white one with black spots that we see on trees. Here's a small one that gets on grapes. And there's what the lady beetle eggs look like. I didn't show you the one that gets into homes in the winter because I figure you all already know what that one looks like. That one's one that has a good and a bad side to it. Green lacewings. Green lacewings are very important predators. They love eating insect eggs, soft-bodied insects, aphids, things like that, even mites. This is what the adult looks like. She's about 1 inch long, little golden eyes on each side of the head. That's what the larva looks like. We call those aphid lions. And the eggs, they're up on little hairs, and you see a little white egg up on the hair. The hairs are about 1/2 inch long. We have bugs that help us out. These are bugs. One way you can recognize some of these beneficial bugs is because their front legs are bigger than their other legs. And they have big front legs because they grab other things, they overpower them, and they feed on them, so they can't run away. It's like the praying mantis has some really powerful legs in front. So those insects that have the powerful legs in front are often beneficial ones. There are some more beneficial ones. Ones with funny names like the big-eyed bug, damsel bugs, and a minute pirate bug up there. We have a beneficial stink bug. This is one that only eats other insects. You recognize it by the marking on its wings right there. It almost looks like a little black tail back there. You see that, you know it's a beneficial stink bug. There's a stink bug that only feeds on Colorado potato beetle. Doesn't feed on plants, but attacks Colorado potato beetle. We even have beneficial flies. These hover flies, their larvae are aphid feeders. So that these are, they're actually feeding on aphids on some tobacco plants there. But they're very good predators. So we have a lot of beneficial predators. This is one reason why we don't want to use insecticides unless we have to. Because one of the unintended consequences is we kill some of these guys. We have parasitoids. So this is a wasp. These little wasps right here are killing that caterpillar. And they're killing it by laying eggs in that caterpillar. The eggs hatch and the larvae feed on the inside of that caterpillar. When they're done feeding, they all exit at the same time and they spin their cocoons. And from each one of those cocoons, you're going to get another one of those little wasps to attach them. So when you see pests with those cocoons, and a lot of people see the hornworms with the cocoons on there, you want to leave those in the garden because that is now turned into something that's going to be helpful. And there's a fly. I know one nemesis of home gardens is the squash bug. And this is one that lays eggs in the squash bug. It's called the feather-legged fly. I wish there were more of them. Take the ones we have, but I wish we had 10 times of them. Because the squash bug is a very tough pest to control. So there's some things you can do to help these natural enemies. One thing is landscaping. Maximize plant diversity and edge effects. You see more of them along the edges of the garden. Pollen and nectar producing plants, small flowers are better. And those big daylilies are not helping anything. But the sweet alyssum, the buckwheat, those really small flowers are what these small beneficial insects need. So I think buckwheat is a very good one. And it's also helping the pollinators. Mulch is also helping some of the predators out there, giving the predators a place to hide. We have insect diseases as well. These are all pictures from Kentucky. Also, that's actually a paper wasp that's been attacked by a fungus. Fungus has grown out of it. I always thought something reminds me of like a Steven Spielberg movie or something like that. But that's a woolly bear that fungus is coming out of. Those are aphids. They're blowing up from fungi. And there's a armyworm that's been killed by fungi. So we have fungi that only kill insects. They don't hurt your plants, and they're called entomopathogenic fungi. Some other things you might want to consider. Here's a picture of row covers. We use row covers at the UK South Farm. We do fruit bagging. It's a way that you can produce apples and peaches without having to spray throughout the summer. You get these gift basket quality apples. We've used netting to keep stink bugs off of peppers. Even plasticulture, you think about it, it's providing weed control around those plants. Hand removal. Hand removal is very important. Weeding is very important. Not knocking pests into a bucket of soapy water is good. Physical methods, I mentioned spraying. I know these aren't vegetables, but sometimes when you have problems with aphids and mites, you can hose those plants down with water that knocks them off. Now, based on what Dr. Pfeiffer said, what time of day would be the best to hose off your aphids and mites? Morning, that's right. You guys are paying close attention to all this. It's good. Traps. Be careful with the insect traps. Some traps do more harm than good. Has anyone heard about the Japanese beetle traps? Yeah, the Japanese beetle traps really bring in a lot of Japanese beetles, but they only capture a fraction of those. And you see more damage around the traps than if you didn't have traps to begin with. I've always made the joke, and it's probably not a good joke, but I've always said best way to use the traps is to buy a lot of them and give them away to your neighbors in Christmas, because you sure don't want to use them on your property. But so this is a Japanese beetle trap. I would say use that with caution. These red spheres for apple maggot, well, they do work, but we don't have apple maggot in the state. So not very useful. Fly traps can help. This slug trap is actually pretty good. They did some research on, someone out in Colorado actually investigated different types of beer to put in the slug traps to see which one worked best. And they found that the non-alcoholic beer was actually the best beer to attract slugs. I think they were researchers that were just trying to buy beer for their research. But pheromone traps, and again, this is getting into things for people that are growing larger acreages, but we do have ways of tracking insects, keeping track of the insect populations with pheromone traps. And you can see, some of these pests. We use it for corn earworm. That's a common vegetable pest. Chemical controls, we do have some soft materials, and I would encourage you to use these soft materials as your routine sprays in your garden. Things like insecticidal soap, horticultural oils, and botanical insecticides, because they're not going to hurt your beneficial insects as much. These are good routine materials. When you do use insecticides, select materials that are less harmful to the environment. We need to be careful. We can pollute water. We can pollute or leave toxic residues on plants. We can hurt beneficial insects. Find things that are less toxic to you. The insecticides generally are the most toxic to us of all the pesticides. It's just because we're more similar to insects than we are to plants. So be careful with your insecticides. Find ones that are specific to the pest. Make sure the vegetable that you're going to spray it on is on the label, and always use the material according to the label. Don't go above the rate on the label. You find it can be toxic to the plant. It can have lots of unintended consequences. And try and find things that are least harmful to beneficial organisms. I mean, these days we're very concerned about monarch butterflies and honeybees. So, it's just some other things. Only use these insecticides when needed. Read the label. Always stay within the labeled range. Be certain the crop is covered by the label. Observe the pre-harvest interval. And by the way, if you're not familiar with the pre-harvest interval, it's the time between when you finish spraying and when you can pick that crop. I've run into some commercial growers, they thought it's the time between when you finish spraying and when you can sell the crop. No, it's when you pick the crop, because it's by leaving it out in the sun, the wind, the rain, that it actually breaks down. So when you pick it and put it in your refrigerator or something like that, those residues are not breaking down. So you need to leave it on the plant until that PHI is over with. Use protective equipment. This is a question I use a lot. I ask people, What is your most valuable thing in life? That's exactly right. Your health and your family's health. There's nothing more valuable than that. And so use that personal protective equipment. Get good coverage when you do spray. Protect pollinators. Don't spray blooming plants. That's how you injure pollinators, is spraying blooming plants. And some resources. One of the same ones that Dr. Piper showed. I also recommend university fact sheets. If you're going to look for good information on the internet, go to the sites that end in edu, because we don't have a commercial interest in that information. It's unbiased and it's research-based information. That's what I had for you. Sorry if I got on my soapbox and was preaching a little bit too much about some things, but I do like pollinators. I do like beneficial insects. Any questions? Looks like a nice evening we're going to have tonight.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
You're welcome.